Good afternoon and good evening, everyone from Toronto. My name is Bhavani Raman, and I teach at the University of Toronto's Department of Historical and Cultural Studies in Scarborough campus, and I'm affiliated with the Department of History. And it's my honor and privilege to welcome you all from all over the world, across time zones, to this important discussion on meritocracy and caste in India. Before I introduce our speakers, who's Professor Ajanta Subramaniam, who's joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Professor Jangam Chinaya, who's joining us from Carleton University, Ottawa, I want to begin by acknowledging this land on which the University of Toronto has been built. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I wish to acknowledge Toronto as in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon territory, the dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers, including myself, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, we're gathered, it's the occasion of Pongal, today, and as I guess one of the faculty members, part of Tamil World's initiative, I do wish everybody a happy Thai Pongal. I also want to thank the sponsors of the event, the co-sponsors, which is the Asian Institute. My special thanks to Professor Christoph Emmerich and to Dasha, who's been invaluable in setting up this online forum and helping to moderate what looks like a very big audience. I wish to thank the Department of Anthropology as well for co-sponsoring Professor Subramaniam's visit. This week, 5 years ago, on the 17th of January 2016, the institutional murder of a young Dalit doctoral student, Rohit Vemula, on the campus of the University of Hyderabad in India, sparked off a massive student protest. It sparked off a lot of public outrage on the issue of caste and on the issue of the university administration's treatment of issues based on caste. Vemula's death was a consequence of his penalization by the university administration for his work as a member of the Ambedkar Student Association, a progressive Indian organization. In a searing final letter that he wrote before his death, Vemula wrote of how he had always wanted to be a writer. He writes, "I wanted to be a writer of science like Carl Sagan." And he writes of his love for science, stars, and nature. And he describes his distress, and I quote, "The value of a man was reduced to his immediate identity and nearest possibility, to a vote, to a number, to a thing. Never was a man treated as a mind, as a glorious thing made up of stardust. In every field, in studies, in streets, in politics, in living and dying. My birth is my fatal accident. I can never recover from my childhood loneliness." Vemula's searing critique of Indian higher education's perpetuation of caste hierarchy, and this, we can extend this critique to higher education more generally across the world, stands on this question. How is it that the university, a place that invites the mind to explore and soar as if it was stardust, how does it become a space where dreams go to die? And whose dreams die in particular in the university? In the light of Rohit Vemula's words, Professor Subramaniam's talk today assumes an added significance. In her book, The Caste of Merit, which I have a copy of here, she writes that over the 19th and 20th centuries, technical knowledge went from being the purview of Indian working caste artisans to being integral to state power, economic development, and upper caste status. This transformation, she says, is tied to the story of engineering education. Bound up with the story of technological modernization is the intimacy of caste and merit. In the book, Professor Subramaniam details how these two supposedly antithetical terms are proximate, how the democratic ideal of meritocracy services, as she notes, the reproduction of inequality, and how the collective inheritances of caste have become emblematic of individual merit. The significance of this relationship, caste and merit, is then of wider import to spaces of the global knowledge economy as well, which run on ideologies of meritocracy. So we can also consider Professor Subramaniam's forthcoming discussion in relationship to, say, for example, the ongoing Cisco case, whereby the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing filed a case against Cisco Systems, a Silicon tech company, for caste discrimination in its workplaces. I would like now to formally introduce Professor Subramaniam. It's a great pleasure to have her here. When we had our annual meeting to discuss all the people we would like to invite, she was really first on our collective list of all the faculty associated in making this event possible. Professor Subramaniam, Ajanta Subramaniam, is Professor of Anthropology and South Asian Studies at Harvard University. Her research interests include political economy, political ecology, colonialism, post-coloniality, space, citizenship, South Asia, and the South Asian diaspora. Her first book, Shorelines, Space and Rights in South India, was published by Stanford University Press in 2009, and it chronicles the struggles for resource rights by Catholic fishers in India's southwestern coast. Her second book, the one that she's going to speak about today, tracks the relationship between caste, meritocracy, and democracy in India in order to understand the production of merit as a form of caste property. Our moderator, we are very, very honored to have Professor Chinaya Jangam, our moderator, joining us from Carleton University in Ottawa. Professor Jangam is an accomplished scholar specializing in modern South Asia and Dalit intellectual history with a focus on Dalits and decolonization and the intellectual engagement of Dalits with colonialism, nationalism, and Christianity. He is the author of an important book, Dalits and the Making of Modern India, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2017, where he explores through Telugu writing the central role played by Dalit publicists, intellectuals, and activists in crafting an ethical and egalitarian vision of Indian nationalism, premised on constitutionalism and informed by the ideas of enlightenment that is often overlooked by historians of modern India. Before I hand over the floor first to Professor Subramaniam and then to Professor Jangam, I just want to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. We are being recorded. Second, all of you who've joined us have been muted just because the numbers are very large, so as to cut ambient noise and interruptions. You are, however, warmly invited to share questions and comments for our speakers to address. I will be moderating the Q&A session as soon as they finish speaking, and these questions will only be seen by the panel, that is to say us, and I will be reading out, as we get those Q&A questions, we'll have a Q&A period in the second half of our session. So with that, Ajanta, the space is yours.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I have to say, every time I hear Rohit Vemula's final letter quoted, it just gives me chills. And it's an appropriate and very meaningful introduction to this conversation. So thank you, Professor Raman, for the invitation, and thank you, Professor Jangam, for engaging the book. I'm really, really looking forward to your comments and looking forward to all of the questions from the audience. So the title of the talk, again, is Meritocracy and Democracy, the Social Life of Caste in India. In India today, the term merit is a ubiquitous folk category that generates a lot of political heat. Over the post-independence period, merit has come to reference forms of distinction that have a much longer social life. And while there are various social distinctions that are at stake in public debates around who does or does not have merit, the most politically charged point of reference is caste. The relationship between caste and merit is widely debated, but nowhere more vocally and consistently than in engineering education. Within the world of Indian engineering education, the institutions seen as most meritocratic are the Indian Institutes of Technology, or IITs, which are the focus of my research. A set of originally 5 institutions founded between 1951 and 61 and deemed institutions of national importance by the IIT Act of 1961, the IITs are directly administered and financed by the Indian central government and fall outside the structure of affiliation to universities, which gives them far greater autonomy in institutional functioning, faculty hiring, and curricular development. Their autonomy was guaranteed in other ways as well. In the name of ensuring merit as the only basis for admission, they were initially exempted from caste-based affirmative action policies. Soon after their founding, the IITs became stepping stones to transnational mobility, especially to the United States. From the 1970s, the professional and economic successes of IIT alumni in both India and the US generated a mad rush to gain admission, pushing the number of candidates steadily upward and spawning a massive coaching industry to train students in preparing for the entrance exam. Within Indian public discourse, the IITian has become an exemplar of intellectual merit, someone seen as naturally gifted in technical knowledge. What gets occluded in such assessments of the IITian's innate intelligence and competitiveness are the historical inheritances that have enabled admission to the IITs. The majority of IITians come from upper caste families of bureaucrats and academics, where capital has long been held in education. While arguably from middle class backgrounds, the value of their accumulated caste capital has spiked due to the reorganization of late 20th and early 21st century capitalism around the so-called knowledge economy. At the same time, the role of caste and state in producing IITians has been obscured in favor of their portrayal as uniquely meritorious individuals. The IIT story provokes some important questions. How does privilege become merit? How does the naturalization of the IITian's merit inform understandings of caste difference? And what does this mean for the possibilities and limits of democratic transformation in India? Before I turn to the research, let me say a little bit about my reasons for taking on this project. One of the main aims was to interrogate the widespread assumption that caste is a more salient basis of social distinction and self-definition for so-called lower than for so-called upper caste. More specifically, upper caste urban professionals are thought to have transcended caste to adopt more modern forms of identification. At the same time, professional classes and institutional spaces like the IITs continue to be majority upper caste in composition. Moreover, attempts at opening up these spaces to lower castes are consistently met with fervent opposition, not in the name of caste, but in the name of preserving merit. Despite continuing caste stratification and the claims to merit by upper castes, there's little scholarship that brings these issues together. And this is where I see my work coming in. I look at the role of engineering education and the IITs in particular in producing claims to merit as expressions of upper casteness. To get at the relationship between caste and merit at the IITs, I build on the work of sociologist Satish Deshpande on how upper castes are rendered casteless in India. The story of how upper castes transform their caste capital into modern capital is not well known, he says, because it runs with the grain of the dominant common sense. When it is seen and heard, it appears to be a story about something other than caste, like the story of nation building, for example. By contrast, the political leveraging of caste by lower castes is a recurrent, politically debated theme. The result of this asymmetry, Deshpande maintains, is that the upper castes are naturalized as the casteless inheritors of modernity, while lower castes are hyper-visible as the illegitimate purveyors of caste. For upper caste, he concludes, caste has already yielded all that it can and represents a ladder that can now be safely kicked away. Having encashed its traditional caste capital and converted it into modern forms of capital like property, higher educational credentials, and strongholds in lucrative professions, this section believes itself to be casteless today. My work builds on Deshpande's but adds a key component, and this is the relationship between subaltern assertion and capital accumulation. Strategies of upper caste capital accumulation must be understood in relation to oppositional politics so that we can see how caste emerges out of longer historical dynamics and continues to be reconfigured in the context of democratic politics. But it's also to make the larger point that historical privilege does not simply reproduce itself. The proliferation of rights politics and the entry of new groups into spaces previously monopolized by upper castes have posed real challenges to caste hierarchies. The claim to merit is one strategy aimed at stabilizing the flux of political life in order to secure arenas of expertise and accumulation against lower caste advancement. However, even this claim to merit is not a guarantee and has to continuously be recalibrated in the face of new challenges. My work on the IITs tracks such changing expressions of upper casteness. While I consider the IIT system as a whole, my main focus is on IIT Madras in the southern state of Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is a particularly illuminating context in which to look at the relationship between lower caste assertion and upper caste capital accumulation, because its history of caste politics has complicated the naturalization of merit and the transformation of upper caste into casteless moderns. Here, as in other regions with histories of lower caste rights, merit is understood as a product of historical privilege and not simply of innate ability. In this sense, Tamil Nadu calls into question Deshpande's account of castelessness as a stable structure of upper caste self-definition. Departing from his analysis, I ask how dynamics in Tamil Nadu might inform an analysis of caste more broadly. When are claims to merit made on the basis of castelessness and when on the basis of caste? And how are status and stigma marked in the absence of explicit invocations of caste? Let me now turn to my research. I'll first give you a brief account of the role of caste in colonial technical education, and then turn to IIT Madras and the making of upper casteness through claims to merit. For the post-colonial period, I will look at three technologies of caste: affirmative action, mass examinations, and diasporic mobility, and use each to show how the contours of upper casteness shift in response to new challenges. But first, let's go back to the 19th century. Caste played a critical role in the induction of Indians into formal technical training in the late colonial period. Through the 19th and early 20th centuries, racial barriers to technical education were expressed through a clear preference for engineers from England. It was only with the rise in nationalist criticism of colonial rule and the expansion of public works that the colonial government began to invest more systematically in formal technical education for Indians. The question of what kind of training this would be and who was best suited for it was hotly debated. From the beginning, we see tensions between two views of engineering. The first expressed an older orientation around engineering as practical learning ill-suited to the classroom. The second, newer view argued for the importance of engineering as formal, conceptual education aligned with the social hierarchies of the colony. While this debate endured into the 20th century, the imperative to formalize engineering as classroom education ultimately won out. Although technical skill was more clearly evident among lower caste artisans and tradesmen, the emerging consensus over engineering as classroom learning and its link to the prestige of the state made literate upper caste the principal targets. In elevating the classroom as the site of engineering education, education planners marginalized those who had technique in favor of those schooled in reading and writing. In many ways, Madras Presidency, the colonial jurisdiction that became the state of Tamil Nadu, was an extreme case of the caste stratification of technical training. Here, the categories of Brahmin and non-Brahmin had become foundational units of administrative sociology through which technical training was implemented. Through the 1910s, concern with the erosion of non-Brahmin occupations in wood, metal, and textiles remained central to technical education policy. Such efforts distinguishing non-Brahmin from Brahmin pursuits strengthened and naturalized the link between caste and technical skill. The effects in the engineering field were clear. As the numbers of Europeans in the Madras engineering services fell, Brahmins were the single largest group to fill the vacuum, despite being barely 3% of the regional population. The correlation between caste and occupation and the overrepresentation of Brahmins in the modern professions became a rallying cry of the non-Brahmin and Dravidian movements, which profoundly reshaped the Tamil political and social milieu. Within the technical sciences too, the impact of Dravidianism was far-reaching. The Southeast was one of the first regions where caste quotas in education and employment were implemented. These measures have had considerable success at changing the caste composition of engineering from the days when Tamil Brahmins filled over 70% of seats in regional engineering colleges. One of the lasting effects of Dravidianism has been a cleavage between Tamil Nadu's other castes and Tamil Brahmins, with caste privilege more closely tied to Brahminness than in many other parts of India. To turn Deshpande's argument on its head, Dravidianism interrupted the translation of caste capital into modern capital by making Brahmins hyper-visible as castes, a move that has been an important catalyst for a more far-reaching politics of meritocracy. An early instance of this is the first post-independence legal challenge to caste quotas. In 1951, two Tamil Brahmin petitioners claimed that their fundamental right to equality and non-discrimination, guaranteed by Article 15.1 of the Constitution, was violated by regional quotas in medical and engineering colleges. The Madras High Court agreed. In a key passage, the judgment stated, and this is a long quote, "It may be that through the fortuitous operation of a rule, which in itself is not discriminatory, a special advantage is enjoyed by some citizens belonging to a particular caste or community. This advantage is not taken away by Article 15.1. If students belonging to a certain community or caste, by reason of their caste discipline, habits, and modes of life, satisfy the prescribed requirements in larger number than others, it's not permissible to shut them out on that score. It would be strange if, in this land of equality and liberty, a class of citizens should be constrained to wear the badge of inferiority because, forsooth, they have a greater aptitude for certain types of education than other classes." Unquote. The judgment redefined caste in two ways: from a system of graded inequality into community life, and from a form of historical advantage into collective aptitude. Moreover, it identified the quota itself as the source of discrimination. Deshpande argues that the 1951 verdict offered upper castes a form of agency based on the universal normative position of castelessness, and authored and disseminated a new kind of common sense, where the very definition of caste was truncated and equated with the lower castes. Significantly, this common sense only deepened after the courts shifted in favor of quotas. Those who qualified for quotas were included in the reserved category on the basis of their caste affiliation, whereas those who did not qualify were simply classed under the general category of merit-based admissions. This absenting of caste from the general category has profoundly shaped the debate around educational equality in India. The distinction between the meritorious or casteless on one side and the reserved or caste-based on the other has allowed those who fall within the general category to argue that its reservations, which is what affirmative action is called in India, that its reservations are not historically derived inequality that undermines equal citizenship. However, there's another side to the 1951 judgment that also lives on, and this is the definition of caste as culture, as natural aptitude, and as the very basis of merit. The early marking of Tamil Brahmins as Brahmins within Dravidinist politics catalyzed the interplay of self-marking and unmarking, through which Tamil Brahmins made caste belonging consistent with merit. They began to mark caste affiliation differently and in ways that were consistent with democratic principles. And they did so in reaction to lower caste assertion and in contradistinction to the reserved category. With the expansion of lower caste rights politics across India, this claim to merit as the non-reserved has become a more generalized phenomenon, seen not just in legal challenges to reservations, but in collective protests and in more quotidian practices. In this sense, caste dynamics in Tamil Nadu set an important precedent for making the general category a putatively democratic norm whose external limit is lower casteness. Let's now turn to the IITs to look more closely at how the Tamil Brahmin precedent set the stage for a proliferating politics of meritocracy. As I noted earlier, three technologies have been central to the making of upper caste merit at the IITs, and the first is affirmative action or reservations. It was in the context of Tamil Brahmin legal challenges that IIT Madras was founded in 1959. As a central government institution exempt from regional caste quotas, it was quickly coveted by Tamil Brahmins as a meritocratic space, shielded from lower caste claims where talent would find its due. This changed in 1973, when central government quotas for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, the groups occupying the lowest tier of the government's list or schedule of social groups, were extended to the IITs. Although there was opposition from all of the IITs, it was IIT Madras that led the charge in condemning the move as government overreach and a violation of meritocracy. The majority of students at the time were the children of upper caste civil servants with shared family histories of education and employment. Within Tamil Nadu, it is Brahmins, the caste that entered the modern professions in the greatest numbers, who formed the core of this class. Unlike their caste compatriots from other parts of India, Tamil Brahmins as targets of Dravidianism responded most defensively to the quota by claiming IIT Madras as their own. We see this in the story of Kalyana Raman, a Tamil Brahmin alumnus from the 1970s. He characterized IIT Madras as a singular ambition of Tamil Brahmin boys shut out of regional education by Dravidianist scapegoating, as he called it. For us, he told me, it was IIT Madras or nothing. All other colleges admit by caste. Only IIT is by merit, unquote. Karthik, another Tamil Brahmin alumnus from the 1990s, emphasized how much IIT Madras felt like home. He talked about the comforting sense of homecoming he felt upon entering the campus gates, where he could slip back into the Brahmin vernacular spoken by his family, and where he experienced a form of extended caste kinship between Tamil Brahmin students and professors, expressed in shared intellectual projects and invitations to family functions. But IIT Madras was not simply a site for Brahmin caste kinship within a so-called non-Brahmin region. Lower caste Tamils who gained admission through the general category were assumed to be Brahmin. Gopi, a lower caste alumnus, narrated his own conscription into Brahminness to me. He was changing his clothes when his Tamil Brahmin roommate inquired into the whereabouts of his punal, the sacred thread worn by male Brahmins. When I told him that I don't wear one, he paused and then asked, "Doesn't your mother get upset?" It never struck him that I was lower caste. In fact, I think he still assumes that I'm from a particularly liberal Brahmin family. Gopi's experience of his own illegibility speaks not to the castelessness of the IITian, but to his explicit marking when it comes to Tamils as Brahmin. Other forms of embodied cultural capital also indexed Brahminness. The display of bodily neglect was one. Ratty t-shirts, torn jeans, and flip-flops signaled a Brahmin background where the consumption of knowledge was prized above commodity consumption. By contrast, dressing well was indicative of being a nouveau riche lower caste who didn't truly value knowledge. These assumptions acquired a disciplining force. Palani, a lower caste student from Chennai, told me how he made a point of switching out his shoes for flip-flops when he came back to campus after weekends at home. It was just easier, he said, than standing out. This desire to erase difference is particularly telling in the context of a region where a history of quotas has brought increasing numbers of lower castes into previously upper caste institutional spaces. Here, IIT Madras serviced the need to once again differentiate high from low. As caste status boundaries were blurring in the wider region, within the walls of the institution, it was imperative to mark all comers within the general category as Brahmin. It was a different story for those who got in through the 1973 quota. One particularly telling instance was of Dinesh, a Dalit student who was a topper at a predominantly upper caste school in Chennai. Throughout his school days, he told me, his classmates would come up with elaborate explanations for why he was the exception that proved the norm of Dalit intellectual inferiority. Although his rank in the IIT admissions exam made him eligible for the general category, he decided to claim the quota to get a better choice of engineering branch, and because, as he put it, it was my right. To his frustration, this became evidence that in the end, I couldn't make the cut. Even when I pointed out that if I hadn't taken a quota seat, one of them wouldn't have gotten in, they still pretended that I didn't have the marks to get in on merit. All these instances, Gopi's misrecognition as Brahmin, Palani's sartorial code switching, and the denial of Dinesh's intellect point to the non-fungibility of the general category. While it purportedly marks a form of achievement available to all, assumptions about the ascriptive bases of merit were ever present. Within IIT Madras, to be non-Brahmin was to be non-meritorious. Moreover, lower caste Tamil students were forced to erase the complexity of their own history to produce flattened forms of caste difference that aligned with expectations of who did or didn't have merit. So how then did this regional dynamic set a precedent for a wider politics of meritocracy? In the 1990s, lower caste rights politics picked up pace in other parts of India, resulting in the emergence of new constituencies and parties. One of the outcomes of this political ferment was the implementation in 1990 and 2006 of new central government quotas for intermediate castes, the so-called other backward classes or OBCs. As a result, what had been a regional dialectic of non-Brahmin claims to rights and Brahmin claims to merit expanded nationally. But now when such claims were articulated, they expressed not Brahminness, but a consolidated form of upper casteness. The 1990 quota, which reserved 27% of seats in public sector jobs for OBCs, ignited a firestorm in North India, with upper caste students engaging in street protests, masquerading as vendors, sweepers, and shoe shiners in a graphic depiction of their future reduction to lower caste labor, and even engaging in acts of self-immolation. That the spectacular courting of death was a political choice speaks volumes about the settled expectations of caste. Rather than a redistributive mechanism, reservations were widely regarded as political pandering to lower castes and a grave injustice to the meritorious. Much of the public discourse at the time rehearsed the virtues of castelessness as an ideal embodied by upper castes and disregarded the lived reality of caste discrimination and exclusion that reservations were intended to redress. The 1990 quota catalyzed new lines of division and precipitated more defensive claims to merit as the non-reserved on the part of upper castes. The 2006 quota, which reserved 27% of seats in all central educational institutions for OBCs, exacerbated this oppositional dynamic. When combined with the 1973 quota, the 2006 quota expanded the reserved category to nearly half the student body of institutions like the IITs. Its implementation further entrenched the opposition between general and reserved as widely shared categories through which the Indian public understood caste difference. In news articles, films, jokes, and online debates emerged an upside-down world where stigmatization and exclusion were the plight of the general category, and the reserved were illegitimate beneficiaries of state corruption. Unmistakable in such commentary is the outrage at the disruption of a natural order, where upper caste dominance is assumed to be a byproduct of talent and desert. Within the IITs, popular prejudice was given further credence through administrative action. In contravention of the legal ruling, IIT administrators have started admitting lower caste students only through the quota, regardless of their exam marks, trying in effect to make the general category itself into an upper caste quota. The ramifications have been far-reaching. After 2006, private sector job recruiters have become vigilant about only hiring general category students. Several who got into IIT Madras through the 2006 quota recounted their chagrin at being pointedly asked for their exam rank at the final stage of recruiting. Despite doing well up to that point, most didn't get the jobs. This trend is in contrast to the previous experience of lower caste students, whose IIT pedigrees were a proven means to social and economic mobility. Unlike then, there is emerging a two-tier system of employment, which ensures that the achievements indexed by the pedigree are mitigated by caste ascription, so that only upper castes are seen as legitimate IITians. To sum up this section, the extension of affirmative action has expanded an identitarian politics of merit from regional to national scale. Just as Dravidianism catalyzed Tamil Brahmin claims to merit, now the expansion of lower caste rights nationally has led to a similarly reactive upper caste politics. Particularly in the context of higher education and private sector employment, the polarized categories of the general and the reserved have superseded more localized caste affiliations to become a new scale of caste difference. Still, this process of caste consolidation has not been smooth. The instability of upper casteness becomes more evident when we consider the second technology of caste, operative at the IITs, and this is the mass examination. The mass examination is commonly taken as an index of modern meritocracy. Unlike earlier processes of selection that explicitly favored a high-born elite, the mass examination was underwritten by an ideology of middle-class achievement, where labor would find its just rewards. Its scale and finely calibrated set of ranked outcomes stood in for a process of objective evaluation beyond social and political influence. However, the promise of open access and equal opportunity was belied by the structuring force of economic and social relations and the ideological power of cultural assumptions. As filtering mechanisms, mass examinations typically favor those who come from histories of education and have a facility with this technical instrument. A case in point is the JEE, the IIT's entrance exam, which arguably represents the fullest realization of India's examination fetish. The JEE is widely perceived as a near perfect measure of merit because the pan-Indian scope of the exam is assumed to filter only the best out of a vast pool of applicants. However, it has been anything but a democratizing force. As noted earlier, the majority of IITians used to be the children of upper caste civil servants. Their parents, themselves participants in another All India ritual, which is the prestigious Union Public Service Commission exam, made a point of training their children to succeed in the intense competitiveness of examination culture. These structural continuities have made caste and class history key to exam success, even as perceptions of the UPSC and JEE as objective filters of individual ability have reinforced an ideology of meritocratic achievement. Assumptions about the mass examination as a social leveler have allowed those who succeed to foreground achievement as a caste trait, while disavowing caste as a structural advantage. In this instance as well, a more explicit claim to ascription as the basis of merit was first expressed by Tamil Brahmins. From the 1940s, Brahmins who felt shut out of regional educational institutions and employment by the quota system invested heavily in exam preparation to enter central government schools and bureaucracies, a phenomenon that one Tamil Brahmin IITian referred to as a caste culture of coaching. With the opening of IIT Madras, this caste culture was directed towards a new goal. I heard many stories of mothers burning the midnight oil with their children, coaxing them to do practice tests so they could crack the JEE. There's a palpable sense within these accounts of both resentment and intellectual superiority, a combined claim to being a scapegoated caste and a uniquely deserving and talented middle class. In the past 10 years, JEE exam coaching that was once more of a Brahmin phenomenon has exploded into $1 billion industry. The massification of coaching has shifted the class profile of students at IIT Madras to include a large contingent from rural upper caste families in the neighboring states of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. Their arrival, however, has not been met with equanimity. In a newspaper interview about the proliferation of coaching classes, IIT Madras's former director, M.S. Anant, clarified that he was, quote, looking for students with raw intelligence and not those with a mind prepared by coaching class tutors. The coaching classes only help students in mastering pattern recognition skills. With this, you cannot get students with raw intelligence, unquote. This notion of raw intelligence places the ideal IITian outside institutional or even social formation as a naturally talented individual with a native capacity for technical knowledge. In conversations with Anand and other IIT administrators, I heard their concerns that the coaching industry undermined the ability of the exam to test for those who were truly worthy, in the process admitting students through the general category who were not actually gifted. It is clear that this divide between the gifted and the coached is not about who attends coaching classes, since virtually all IITians do. Who then are the coached? When pushed, I heard that they were from less urban, professional, and English-speaking backgrounds. They were the ones who attended the so-called coaching factories in Andhra Pradesh and Rajasthan, where learning was thought to be rote and sharply distinguished from the more boutique, conceptual classes attended by the urban middle class. These were students for whom, as one administrator said ruefully, the IIT merely represents a paycheck and a local job for life. As with the performance of bodily neglect, the distinction between the gifted and the coached is understood through specific qualities. The one most often mentioned is groupism. Students from Andhra Pradesh's coaching factories are routinely charged with changing campus culture by bringing in their regional affiliations and languages. Although Brahmin, Tamil, and Hindi are also heard quite commonly on campus, it is Telugu, the main language of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, that is marked as regional and parochial. Of course, other forms of collectivity are key to what it means to be an IITian. I heard numerous stories of male bonding over all-night debates on everything from obscure mathematical formulas to the evidence of science in Vedic texts. Such stories take place in the dorm room and not the classroom, and mark a form of upper caste homosociality that is key to institutional kinship. But it is only Telugu speakers who are taken as a disruptive collective presence. In some ways, it is these students who most destabilize the equation of merit with upper casteness. As noted earlier, the implementation of the 2006 quota has made it even easier to consign all lower caste students to the undeserving reserved category. But students from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana are problematic because they are the wrong kind of upper caste. Their so-called rote learning, bad English, and open embrace of regionalism blur the boundary between the general and the reserved. To recap again, at IIT Madras, the challenges to upper caste hegemony posed by successive waves of affirmative action produced a polarized student body and an incessant diagnostics of caste to root out the undeserving. They also generated identitarian claims to merit that more openly express a link between caste ascription and achievement. However, the entry of students from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana has been unsettling, leading those from class histories of higher education and professional employment to distinguish themselves not just from lower castes, but from non-ideal upper castes in order to claim merit as their exclusive property. That the claim to merit is in fact about property becomes clearer when we consider the final technology of caste, which is diasporic mobility. Caste inheritances have long been key to diasporic mobility. Here too, the Tamil Brahmin story prefigures a more widespread pattern. Over the 20th century, and in the face of lower caste demands for the redistribution of power and resources, Tamil Brahmins have used mobility from countryside to city, from public to private sector, and from South India to the north and to other countries as a means to secure their economic and social standing. They're also acutely aware of this pattern. In Tamil Brahmin narratives, mobility comes across as an expression of cultural genius that across successive generations has allowed them to preserve merit against the odds. The Tamil Brahmin use of mobility as a form of maneuver anticipated similar trends across India. In the post-independence period, diasporic mobility emerged as a key tool for a wide spectrum of upper castes, looking to secure the conditions of capital accumulation in the face of lower caste demands for access to public education and state employment. From the 1960s, the US emerged as the favored destination and quickly became the most affluent and highly educated node of the diaspora. Diasporic success has been hugely significant for reinforcing the link between meritocracy and caste. With geographical distance from India and from challenges to caste entitlement, upper caste achievement abroad appears to be a form of self-made success. At the same time, the highly selective character of the US Indian diaspora makes easier a seamless equation between being upper caste, being Indian, and having merit. Within the US Indian diaspora, IIT alumni have been particularly active in shoring up their status as uniquely meritocratic individuals. After the information technology boom of the 1990s, IITians in Silicon Valley began forging a new claim to ascription as the basis of achievement. Now, however, it was a form of racial ascription through which they sought to make Indianness synonymous with technical prowess and brand IIT with commodity value. The early 2000s was a critical time for this project of racial ascription. Various magazines featured articles on the IITs. Forbes did a story titled Indians of Silicon Valley. Business Week came out with India's Genius Factories. Most important, however, was a 2003 60 Minutes episode on the IITs, a carefully curated bit of publicity featuring choice quotes from prominent alumni that made the case for diasporic success as a natural extension of an IIT education. One of the highlights of the piece is an interview with Vinod Khosla, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems, who observes that Fortune 500 headhunters favor IITians over almost anybody else. As he put it, if you're a WASP walking in for a job, you wouldn't have as much pre-assigned credibility as you do if you're an engineer from IIT. With this blend of new and old racial stereotypes, the IITs were brought more firmly into American popular consciousness. Increasingly, this project of self-racialization has been yoked to the cultivation of entrepreneurship. The Indus Entrepreneurs, an organization started by IIT alumni in Silicon Valley in 1992, currently boasts a membership of over 13,000, and its list of mentors includes the most well-recognized Indian names in the corporate sector. In conversations with both senior mentors and junior members of the organization, it became obvious that the entrepreneurial ambitions of IITians are the most actively cultivated. When a group of IITians brings forward a proposal, they're almost guaranteed seed funding. These expressions of transnational institutional kinship have both underwritten the commodity value of an IIT education and enhanced the racial mystique around the IITian's intellect. Such media events and institutional mechanisms have worked to elevate the status of the IITs and their diasporic ambassadors. Entrepreneurial accomplishments, that's a hard word to say, have reinforced a model minority success story in which caste, when it does figure, is reframed as communitarianism or middle classness. But they have also produced new schisms between diasporic and homeland IITians. It's clear from speaking to Silicon Valley's IITians that they share a spatial imaginary of constraint and possibility. As do homeland alumni, they insist that in India, they were limited by a system that fostered mediocrity in the name of democracy, and where the IITs were islands of meritocracy. But there's also something new. In their embrace of entrepreneurial wealth accumulation as the basis of merit, IITians in Silicon Valley are increasingly at odds with an older upper caste orientation around higher education and lifelong professional employment. Like their homeland counterparts, most are the children of civil servants and public sector engineers. With transnational mobility, however, they've gone from being beneficiaries of the developmental state to its most strident detractors. Significantly, their disdain for the Indian public sector now also extends to homeland IITians. As they see it, Indian conditions have forced IITians who stayed behind to slip into mediocrity, with the result that only the diasporic IITian truly embodies brand IIT. The diasporic project of brand elevation has certainly had an impressive reach. When I asked IIT students in the late 2000s about their role models, most mentioned Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. They also used the language of branding to define their own value. Sandeep, a 2009 alumnus, pointed out that one's branch of engineering was hardly relevant anymore. Even though they haven't done any related courses, everyone is going into finance and business and marketing, he told me, adding that despite their disregard for the engineering curriculum, IITians still got the best jobs because of the brand name. IIT Madras now offers a Master's of Science in Entrepreneurship and a student-run entrepreneurship cell, which aims to foster an entrepreneurship culture on campus. Many Homeland alumni also endorse the diasporic branding project as good for the institution. As one put it, the brand is a kind of ISO mark. You're assured of quality, like when you see a car made in Japan, it immediately sells. However, not everyone echoed these commitments to branding and entrepreneurship. When I asked one Homeland alumnus to compare alumni activity in the US and India, he responded without skipping a beat. In USA, it's brand building. Here, it's nation building. As examples of nation builders, he offered a diverse list of alumni, including an Ayurvedic doctor, a school principal, a minister of environment, and the head of an NGO working in primary education. These are all IITians who have contributed to the development of the country, he said pointedly. But all you hear about now is Silicon Valley. Another alumnus who now teaches at IIT Madras confided that the entrepreneurship craze, as he called it, was demoralizing for faculty, whose students were far more interested in attracting the attention of venture capitalists than in learning the curriculum. Now, instead of engineering, he remarked in frustration, all they want to understand is the business of business. Particularly noteworthy was the stance of some Tamil Brahmin alumni, who expressed a distaste for the blatant embrace of accumulation, which they felt was more aligned with a mercantile sensibility. They spoke of this as a disturbing departure from an older model of ascetic intellectualism that they claimed was a trademark characteristic of IIT Madras. One expressed his disquiet by saying, all these good Brahminical values that, at least in the minds of some people in the South, used to mean that you should be good in academics and intellectual pursuits, that should be the overriding ambition, and you shouldn't be taken in by all of these material things. All that has vanished. The invocation of bygone Brahminical values speaks volumes about the continuing transformation of upper casteness. As with the opposition between the general and reserved and the gifted and coached, new tensions have arisen between intellectual and entrepreneurial conceptions of merit. The diasporic model of upper casteness, in which entrepreneurial wealth accumulation is elevated as the true measure of merit, has not been embraced by all IITians. To their surprise, those who were once emblematic of upper caste meritocracy now find themselves resisting its most recent iteration. So to conclude, in post-independence India, new patterns of caste stratification and consolidation have emerged through the very process of democratic change. Rather than the gradual erosion of caste, what we're witnessing is the leveraging of merit as an expression of upper casteness, aimed at securing arenas of expertise and accumulation against democratizing changes. Such claims to merit stage the interplay of ascription and achievement, through which the inheritances of caste are made into markers of meritocratic success. Tamil Nadu is an important precedent for understanding this interplay. By throwing into relief the ascriptive bases of achievement, Dravidianism forced Tamil Brahmins into a reactive claim to merit as an expression of caste culture. From the 1990s, this dynamic expanded nationally, making more explicit the equation between caste and merit, and polarizing consolidated groupings of upper and lower castes. Exam coaching was one spanner in the works that forced a redefinition of merit as both a caste and a class characteristic. And while in many respects diasporic mobility allowed for more unfettered accumulation, the project of Brand IIT has found detractors among homeland alumni who contest the equation of upper caste merit with entrepreneurial success. So what does this process suggest for our understanding of democracy? For one, the intimacy between caste and merit throws into question the widespread assumption that identitarianism is principally a politics of the marginalized. The leveraging of merit is just one example of an identity politics aimed at shoring up historical privilege and forestalling progress towards a more egalitarian society. And second, these shifting expressions of upper casteness show the instability of privilege and the work that it takes to maintain the upper hand. Privilege is often treated as a stable structure with a self-perpetuating logic to which subalterns respond with dynamic forms of affiliation and maneuver. Analyses of subaltern politics have provoked a reappraisal of democratic politics to include forms of political agency previously seen as pre-political, non-political, or non-democratic. Despite these ways of rethinking democracy, however, there has been less effort to understand how the political imaginaries and tactics of the powerful are themselves relationally constituted and subject to recalibration. The story of making merit at the IITs illuminates this broader relational dynamic as an integral part of the democratic process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajanta. So I'll go ahead and yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful talk you gave, and it really made us go through this long history of from colonialism to post-colonial state in which we live, and also the way in which these transformations have happened. And particularly one important thing is that I want to note before I make my remarks is how critical is your work for us, particularly people involved in anti-caste mobilizations and anti-caste advocacy, and also now in the context in which we live, particularly the Hindu fascism and the way in which it is attacking the fundamentals of the constitution and also the idea of social justice. And your work particularly speaks volumes, and as Bhavani pointed out in the beginning, like death of Rohit Vemula and how it has changed the very idea of democracy and also the idea of meritocracy, particularly in university campuses. So in this context, I think your work is really one of the very important interventions in terms of understanding this caste privilege, particularly in the how the upper caste use merit as a very important way to counter the agenda of social justice, without acknowledging the very idea that this merit is nothing but a caste privilege which has been inherited for centuries together. So in this context, I think talking about this and exposing this history of privilege and how basically these privileges are protected across the spectrum, particularly from colonial context all the way into post-colonial context. I think this work really reflects in terms of showing us this very seamlessness with which caste privilege has been protected, despite democratic politics, despite colonial interruption, and despite the idea of modern nation state formations. One of the important things is that it continues as a privilege, particularly given to the upper caste people who are able to protect, and also in multiple ways, as you pointed out the end of your talk about the fragility of the privilege, how the very idea of this privilege, it's a it shifts according to the historical transformations and challenges, how it is able to adapt itself and protect itself. So in that context, I think it's historical precisely because, it provides us a very interesting avenue in terms of understanding the seamlessness with which caste privilege operated. The second thing is that even in terms of anti-caste mobilizations and also the way in which we talk about the social justice agenda and advocacy, one of the important ways, and I think in your introduction of the book, you pointed about there's so much work is on the social life of caste among lower caste people, particularly Dalits and other underprivileged. And you have this beautiful thing to talk about how Fox and M.N. Srinivas and also all the way to Deshpande. One of the important thing is that there's so much talk about this way in which caste has been practiced, and also social life of caste and experience among particularly disprivileged and unprivileged castes. But there is very little about how privileged caste organize, this whole idea of upper casteness. And I think those politics needs to be brought out. And in this context, I think your work for me is very, speaks to me precisely because of that. And in this sense, like when we talk about caste, it's not just like you talk about identitarian politics, which are seen as this lower caste using as a very interesting way in terms of asserting social justice agenda and politics of assertion. But actually, there is no discussion about how upper caste organize and how upper caste basically use this modernity and modernness or castelessness as a very important way to reassert their domination over institutions and also political space and also in terms of ideology. I think this is where it extends all the way into the Hindu right mobilizations. Particularly you talk about in terms of mandal politics, you talk 1990s and also 2000, this extension of OBC reservations, how it has completely disrupted the idea of this privilege, which basically where they could IITs as symbols of exceptionalism and excellence and technocracy. But that protection has been disrupted by this politics of democratic assertion, which ultimately what it does is that when it disrupts, how this again has a lot of implications in terms of growth of Hindu fascism or Hindu right politics in India. That's when when we talk about it, you talk about it, how diaspora becomes this global symbol, particularly in the Silicon Valley, and it is the same diaspora which funds Hindu right politics in North America. So that's why it is very interesting to see from all the way from India, colonial India, to the post-colonial fascist stage in which Indian state has reached. What you see is that it is the same elites who are vanguards of these movements, even in terms of colonial state. That's what that's very interesting. I noted in my notes when while reading the book, and one of the important things I saw this the connection you make, particularly in terms of how at various stages this whole idea of colonizing caste and how it happens, particularly in terms of the the colonizing caste, and also you also talk about racialization of caste. In fact, you use that term in your introduction, and how this basically has very interesting implications in terms of in the success of colonial project, indigenous elites. Like you talk about Ram Mohan Rai opposing about establishing a Sanskrit college in Calcutta. Instead, he asked for technical or technical education or rational education. And in this context, what you see that the affiliation of colonial elite, particularly when they came into Indian subcontinent and trying to understand, establish the colonial order, it is the same Brahmanical elites who are part of this colonial project. So that's why this translation, I think Bhavani's work will talk about this, translators of Dubashis, and how in terms of early colonialism, affiliation with the indigenous elites becomes very important part of this project of colonization. Thus, what you see is that in the beginning, it is the Sanskritic Brahmanical elites who help the colonialism to succeed, both as bureaucrats and also clerks and various other informants, and also as success. That's how what you see that the story of colonialism in South Asia is very different from other forms of colonialism in different colonial settings, because here indigenous elites are actively involved in the project of colonialism, particularly the Brahminical elites. And then what happens is that these Brahminical elites, when they were this, that's why the way in which stages of assimilation of Brahminical elites into colonialism is a very interesting way, though you don't talk elaborately in your work. But the thing is, that's what I was able to see, this interesting connection from Sanskritic translators to Sanskritic pundits into how basically gradually they are brought into this technical education. And within that, and also in the complicity of colonialism and Brahminism, in devaluing the artisanal classes, particularly who were the harbingers of technology and also innovation, how they have been devalued and also decontextualized within the context of India. That's why you talk about shop floor to classroom, how the shift happens. And therefore, what you see that there is a complete way in which the colonialism, how Brahminism and colonialism work together in this project of not only success of colonialism, but also protecting this, very interestingly, the privilege of the upper caste people, especially Brahminical elite. So in this context, what happens is that I also see very interesting connection between, because of the colonialisms and Brahminism's connection, the whiteness and upper casteness, how they closely align as projects. That's why one of the ways in which, that's where, I was thinking about how, for example, historically, if you see Gandhi in South Africa, when he was in South Africa, he refused to identify with Black people, Africans. He saw himself as a very different being, and he wanted to be equal to a white man rather than with an African. And he was also conscious about his caste status when he was interacting with, again, laborers from Tamil Nadu and also laborers from Telugu speaking areas. And in fact, he explicitly talked about these people, how they are very different from. So in this context, what you see that the upper casteness, the historical development of this upper casteness, not just happens through IITs, but it also the colonial project, which continues without any interruption. That's why you see that, the early absorption of Indians into particularly bureaucracy, law, and all these things, again, how it transitions into technical education is a very interesting way in which basically how the caste degradation of artisanal class happens. And that's when what you see that engineering education to as a colonial conception, what happens is that it is a very interesting relationship with colonialism and racial politics. That's why what you see that like, why is it that along with this technical education, why Indians become very exotic in the eyes of the white people? Why is it that we are able to sell yoga and vegetarianism very well, precisely because of this politics of colonialism, how it has exoticized and affiliated itself with the Brahminism. And I think this whole idea of racial politics have a lot to do with the way in which British colonialism has interacted with the Brahminical elites. Therefore, what happens is that but it is the same Brahminical elites again who try to speak against colonialism, but also emulate it, the forms in which it tries to. That's why you see that very interesting relationship between the racial politics of exclusion and also caste politics of exclusion. And that's what you see is that you have this very interesting ways in which they build institutions also in such a way that when Nehru, you talk about when he talks about when inauguration of first convocation of IIT Kharagpur, where Nehru talks about democracy is a problem because he sees that democracy equals to mediocrity. And that's why this exclusivity of the institution. So what you see that like post-independent India, like when we come into this establishment of the institutions as these institutions of exception and exceptionalism, how this whole idea happens, particularly in the context of this protected communities, particularly entrance into these institutions, and how they are nurtured and also funded at the expense of the state. And this, I think this is what, like, one of the important things I see that the Hindu Brahminical consciousness inherent in the very foundations of nation state, in which basically even secular Nehru also becomes very actually part of this promotion of this Brahminical exclusivity and Brahminical merit. And in this context, what happens is that though that's why from 1951 for the first IIT establishment to 1973 there is no reservation. like during his time. So though he claims to be a socialist and whatever this thing, but these institutions were not brought under the purview of reservation system till 1973. So in this context, what you see that this, I see this very interesting continuity, like particularly the colonialism, Brahmanism, and also post-colonial nation states, how they align with this whole idea of the making of this upper casteness as a very important way in which these state institutions or structures were protected. And it was a conscious effort. It is not unconscious. That is very interesting. Like the way in which this every institutional exclusion of lower caste or artisanal caste or from these institutions is a conscious. It is not unconscious. It is invested. That's what you see in terms of the way these people talk about farmer alumni and their experiences, everything. What is the institutions builders also? You talk about one of the dissenting note about when the founding of these Sarkari commissions, when you talk about dissenting notes within that, these are all consciously invested and also conceived in such a way that exclusion is part of this designing of these institutions. So in this context, what I see is that it is in this context what you see that this post-colonial nation state and also the making of upper casteness becomes, and again upper casteness also gets into they themselves become this whole idea of moderns. And also I was thinking while reading, like the way in which this whole idea of technical education, appropriation of technical education or engineering education by the upper caste has a lot of interesting connection with the way in which upper castes have assimilated or appropriated dance forms, for example. Recently, I was at a seminar in UPenn, and I think Sanoji is his name. He does this very interesting work about how the early cinema, the most of the female actors were lower caste women because upper caste women did not cast. And then what happens is eventually these art forms were taken over by the Brahmin women, and this whole idea of beauty has changed in this context. What happens is that it goes into various forms in which this these where upper caste appropriate, and you also talk about the way in which no correlationship between the caste status, caste ascription, and also the profession. When it comes to upper caste, they can do anything. You can be a Brahmin, you can be investment. Being a Brahmin, you can be an investment banker. You can be a doctor. You can do anything as long as you're an upper casteness. So in this context, what you see is that the post-colonial nation state plays a very, very important role in this legitimizing this upper caste privilege, and the appropriation of this, what do you call, the skills of the lower caste people, and afterwards what happens is excluding and degrading them. That's why what you see that I see very interesting way these politics are happening. And the other important thing I talked, I think I hope I'm not exceeding my time, right, Bhavani? Yeah. So
I think you should maybe move to questions, China, because we have about 50 minutes.
Okay, then last point I want to make about this social justice and meritocracy, and how basically the way in which this whole idea of meritocracy tries to checkmate the politics of social justice and democracy. So in this context, what you see is that you have this. I think that's where the anti-Mandal politics and the diaspora's dissent against lower caste people coming into different challenging, and coming into different spheres becomes very important. And that's why one of the ways in which this upper caste, particular diaspora which is settled in North America, they at one level, they have disdainful at hate for the politics of the lower caste, but that's one of the ways in which they try to embrace the Hindu right politics, because what happens is that it caters to their aspirations of anti-caste and also anti-Muslim politics. And the last one I was thinking, Ajanta, sorry, I was thinking about, did you come across IITians who are OBCs and SCs? How do they conceive themselves in the politics of IIT imagination and other things? So I will stop with that and we'll have more. Thank you very much. It's wonderful work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, China. Ajanta, do you want to respond briefly to Professor Jangam's comments, and then the chat box? I have a lot of questions.
Why don't we move to the questions, just so we have time for them, and I'll weave in the comments as I respond to other questions. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we get to enough of them.
So we've had a lot of questions, and maybe what I can do is maybe pick up from something that Chinay already brought up.
Yeah.
The last question concerning the experiences of those who don't identify as Brahmin or who are not as Brahmin, who then find themselves on these college campuses.
Yeah.
And in that context, I've got a lot of questions, and if I were to kind of summarize it in 1 or 2 sentences, it would be: what choices are you exercising by identifying the label Brahmin with upper casteness, and the label non-Brahmin with lower casteness, given that there are a number of intermediary castes and other forms of caste domination that we can find at the sub-regional and other levels, and in particular professions, in other professions.
I don't mean to suggest that that there's only one form of distinction, right, between Brahmin and non-Brahmin. Part of what I'm trying to capture in the book is how certain forms of distinction come into play, right, and become kind of incorporative, right? So Brahmin and non-Brahmin, of course, are these sort of omnibus categories, right, that are incorporative, and often, efface tensions, internal tensions, right, which endure. And similarly, when you look at dynamics within the IITs, when I'm talking about the making of upper casteness, I'm talking about a similar process of incorporation, right? Whereby a number of different social groups, right, come to affiliate as members of this general category, right? And by extension as meritocratic subjects, right? Now, the general category can even include, groups that are typologized as lower castes, right? So there's a kind of, there's a sort of aspirational quality to these categories and the way people affiliate, right? But having said that, when you look at something like the general category, on the one hand, it seems to be more encompassing, right, than simply upper castes, right? On the other hand, when OBCs or Dalits lay claim to merit within these institutions, as they often do, right, they're only legible as exceptions, right? So it's this, that's partly what's so interesting about the politics of merit, is it always sort of masquerades as universal, right? That these are categories that can be inhabited by everybody. But when push comes to shove, you see these forms of ascription being smuggled in, right? I mean, one of the ways that Tamil Nadu, I think, also figures in this story is Tamil Nadu has been a very important site for making the professions more representative of the wider society, right? So if you look at professional classes in Tamil Nadu, they tend to have lots of OBCs, right? Even some Dalits, also, although that's less the case, right? So in that sense, I think Tamil Nadu has been successful at challenging a kind of Brahmin monopoly over certain professions. But what it has not done is challenge the status of the professions themselves, right? So there is still very much in place a kind of hierarchy of labor where the only thing to aspire to, right, is professional life. right? So so that is kind of kept in place in a way that ultimately is to the disadvantage of the most disadvantaged groups, right? So groups that can never aspire to enter an institution like the IITs. This kind of, even a successful claim on the part of OBCs or Dalits to the IITs leaves out this whole other kind of sphere of social and political life, right? Which are not accommodated at all. So, you know, I'm not suggesting that these other kinds of caste fissures and caste differences are no longer operative, but I'm very interested in trying to capture the forms of consolidation that institutions like the IITs afford, right? They become kind of, they mediate these forms of consolidation, which take on a life of their own.
Mm-hmm. So I guess you're also getting us to think a little bit about selective self-affiliation and selective assimilation into these broader hegemonic
categories.
Categories on university campuses like IIT. Concerned with that, I think there are a whole bunch of questions concerning the more kind of sociological aspects of your work. One was a number of people wanted to know how caste plays a role when it comes to research programs in IIT Madras. So for example, MTech and PhD student populations across IIT campuses. And did you actually study if there was any variation among the different campuses?
I didn't look too closely at the non-BTech population. I was mainly looking at the BTech population. Now, part of what's interesting about the MTechs, not even the MTech so much as the PhDs, and I'm talking mainly about the PhDs in the humanities, right? They have been very central to anti-caste organizing on IIT campuses, right? And you know, which is interesting, right? So you know, they come in with a certain kind of critical caste consciousness, I suppose, which is fostered within the humanities departments in a way that it isn't in, you know, in the rest of the campus. So so Rohit Vemala is a perfect example, right, of a PhD scholar on a central government campus who, you know, brings with him a kind of, you know, critical sentiment, right, which is then arrayed against certain forms of institutional casteism. So you see similar things happening at the IITs. Now, I think, you know, so let me just stop there with that. I mean, I didn't look as much at the sort of research side of things, but to the extent that I did, it was the role of research scholars in anti-caste politics. Yeah.
I had another sort of interesting comment and question associated again, this time with the sociological and more embodied markers of caste. And I think maybe your comments regarding the sacred thread that's conventionally borne by Brahmins was brought this out, which is the degree to which your talk actually does a very interesting mapping of the transformation of caste belonging through the language of merit, right? So caste is then a kind of a modern category that is available to modern subjects as a form of capital, upper casteness, as an unmarked form of capital. At the same time, what does that do to the embodiment of caste on campus? So how do you reconcile both in some senses through the research and the kind of interviews that that you kind of conducted?
Yeah. I mean, this is why I think the interplay between unmarking and marking is so important, right? So, and this is where I sort of depart somewhat from Deshpande's arguments, right? About upper casteness as a sort of, as a stable, unmarked category, right? Whereas, you know, I think when you look ethnographically at the way caste is inhabited on campuses like the IITs, you know, you see that there is this very kind of charged diagnostics, right? That's always in play, right? Where people are trying to read caste off the body, right? And mark caste on their own bodies, right? Except that this is framed in terms of merit, right? So there's a kind of, caste is not an explicit language necessarily, but there's a language of merit through which gradations of belonging, right, are produced, right? Gradations of desert are produced on these campuses. And again, I think this is where the sort of Tamil Brahmin case is really useful to think with, because the forms of self-ascription, right? The claim to caste on the part of Tamil Brahmins, what I'm arguing is that that is a response to oppositional politics, right? So one goes from being a kind of comfortably unmarked subject, right, to having a much more kind of identitarian form of affiliation in response to oppositional politics, right? So it's with the rise of Dravidianism that Tamil Brahmins go from being universal subjects to being caste subjects, right? And to making claims in the language of caste. And so, you know, over the course of, you know, the period that I'm looking at, you see a similar thing happening with a much wider spectrum of upper caste, right? They come to claim merit, not just as a kind of unmarked universal claim, but as an identitarian claim, right? And they're doing this because you have a growing anti-caste OBC politics that's on the rise, that's basically forcing them back on their heels, right? Does that make sense? So there's a kind of, there's a shift from a kind of universalistic politics of upper casteness to a far more shrill identitarian politics of upper casteness that I'm tracking. And that shift is occasioned by the rise of a kind of by the rise of anti-caste politics, right? By subaltern assertion. It's in response to that these claims become more identitarian. Right? And that dialectic for me, the sort of Tamil Brahmin example is an important precedent for that dialectic, which becomes much more expansive, right?
I think that's a very valuable kind of comment and response in sort of, I think, showcasing, as you do both in your book and in your talk, of the Tamil Brahmin experience from the 1960s onwards, 1950s onwards, as a precedent that then becomes a template for other people, other groups, other regions to go through similar processes of self-identification through the idea of merit. And I think you rightly point us to the 1990s as, you know, kind of the explosion of this at an all India scale. The other theme that I wanted to pick up, which was also mentioned a little bit by Professor Jangam in his comments, but then has really come out a lot in the chat box, is on the question of entrepreneurship and the entrepreneur as a kind of figure and as an ethic that you argue has been embraced by IIT students and IIT alumni in particular from the 1990s. And this really takes us into the kind of the heart of the global economy on the one hand, the global knowledge economy, which facilitated, as you argue there, the mobility of IITians to Silicon Valley. But there is another story of entrepreneurship that's emerging from India at the same time, and which really we see encapsulated in the Narendra Modi government's embrace of entrepreneurship and the positioning of entrepreneurship as an unmarked category, but which is particularly attractive to upwardly mobile, lower caste people to move up in life. So there is a sort of framing of entrepreneurship as aspiration, as a possibility of market forces, providing those opportunities and that environment. So there is also, would you say, how would you respond to that? And, you know, often this is kind of passed in the public media and has been passed in some of these comments in the chat box as, well, Narendra Modi doesn't belong to an upper caste background, or he claims he doesn't belong to an upper caste background, right? So there is a way by which that understanding of entrepreneurship and that invitation into Hindutva politics via entrepreneurship is also, out there and circulating. So how do we make sense of these two things that are happening simultaneously?
Yeah.
I just want to say something. I think everything else, there is no proof that, Narendra Modi belongs to lower caste. Like his degrees, even his social identity is problematic.
Look, I mean, one could say the same thing about technical education itself, right? Technical education was heralded as the knowledge of the everyman, right? So unlike law, literature, right, which was always seen as the sort of preserve of a caste elite, technical education was supposed to be a democratizing force, right? It was supposed to be something that allowed for social mobility, social and economic mobility, right? And in many respects, it has. There are huge numbers of engineering institutions. There are lots of lower castes who have experienced some measure of educational and economic mobility, right, through the technical sciences. But at the same time, it is a highly stratified sphere, right? And the IITs are the pinnacle, and they occupy the pinnacle in part because of another distinction that has emerged within the technical sciences, and that's between the conceptual and the manual, right? So just as in the colonial period, you have this distinction between artisanship and engineering, right? That's framed in terms of a distinction between not just the shop floor and the classroom, but between the manual and the conceptual. You see a very similar thing happening in the post-independence period within engineering education, right? The stratification, the institutional stratification through which, the lowest tier engineering colleges are seen as more oriented around the manual, and the highest tier being more oriented around the conceptual. So, I think entrepreneurship is similarly a kind of, it's seen as the knowledge and skill of the everyman, right? That this is something which this is how it's peddled, right? It's peddled as something which
repositioning going on here, right? I mean, one can argue there's a repositioning of entrepreneurship as a category of general aspiration, which wasn't
general aspiration. Absolutely,
very caste marked. I mean, it was considered a very caste marked field.
It was okay. So I mean, one can think of it. I mean, Professor Jangam was talking about these other forms of upper caste appropriation, right? Right. The one could think of it in terms of Sanskritization, perhaps, right? That you have forms of knowledge and skill which were historically the preserve of the non-elite, right? Which become. Are we frozen? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay.
We can hear you.
Which sort of become cleansed, right, of certain forms of social identity and available to more elite classes. And one could say the same thing about entrepreneurship, right? That on the one hand, there's a form of that it's become a kind of aspirational identity, right? For groups which at an earlier moment would have eschewed it, right? As non-intellectual, as somehow unfitting, right, for them. And you hear this echoed in that last quote from the Tamil Brahmin, who's sort of unsettled, right, by the embrace of entrepreneurialism on the part of his fellow IITians, because he sees this as a kind of departure from an older kind of caste ethos, right? That this is something which sort of the intellectual caste should not aspire to, right? That it's a kind of, it's a mere form of it's almost too affiliated with the market, right? That we actually engage in other forms of skill and knowledge, which aren't sort of tainted by the market. So I think you see this happen. I think entrepreneurialism is interesting because it's it can be seen both as a new form of elite aspiration, right? And a new claim to global modernity, right? I mean, this is the way it's framed in spaces like Silicon Valley, right? It's the new avenue for accumulation, right?
Well, also it seems from your book and from your talk, you're also suggesting that it, even if it might be ostensibly a field that invites everybody to partake in, as opposed to going to an engineering school, you know, anybody can become a digital entrepreneur or whatever.
Exactly.
There is a logic where it does converge around the idea of merit. It becomes the ultimate test of an assertion of your merit to be a successful.
I think it's like American dream, right? Anyone can dream, but
Yeah,
everyone.
there is a connection there. And yeah,
And-
thanks for bringing that up. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this is, you know, in some ways, this is the logic of meritocracy in a capsule, right? That it's an ideology of universalism, right? That hides within it a mechanism of exclusion and stratification, right? And one can say that for engineering education. One can say that about entrepreneurialism, right? That it's one of the reasons it's so attractive is because it seems entirely consistent with democratic promise, right? While at the same time serving as the basis for continued stratification and exclusion, right?
So on that, there are a couple of questions that specifically ask whether engineering, in your estimation and in your research, came up as a particular subtext of nation building. And that's why you decided to focus your questions on merit on the engineering profession. And then relatedly, there are questions that are asking about why you chose engineering as opposed to, say, medicine or medical school, and whether what you learned from the engineering, researching the engineering profession and its creation in the IITs can be transposed to another profession, namely medicine.
Yeah, I mean, medicine is it's an interesting sort of parallel narrative, right, to engineering, insofar as, like engineering, like the technical, right, the medical was not the preserve of the caste elite, right? In fact, it was seen as tainting, right? Right, sort of, it was too much of the body, right? And so, like the technical, which was similarly seen as too much of the body, the medical occupied a similar status historically. So I think it would be very interesting to look at the transformation of medicine, right, into a kind of elite persuasion and how that comes about, right? And what that has to do with a transformation in the understanding of the link between caste and occupation, right? Right. So how does caste shift, right, to become a much more sort of flexible form of identification that can incorporate all of these practices that might, at an earlier moment, have been seen as the basis for outcasting, right? So I think one can tell a similar story about medicine as about engineering. I think what's so interesting about engineering is that, yes, you know, it was at the heart of technical knowledge and technological development, right? Was almost synonymous with nation building in India, right? So you see this massive state investment in the technical sciences, right, as part of the nation building project from the outset. And so this kind of the intimacy between engineering and nationalism, right, the elevation of the engineer as the nation builder par excellence, I think, places it in a slightly different category from other professions, which even if you can track a similar process of sort of cleansing and expropriation on the part of elites, doesn't occupy the same kind of status in relation to conceptions of modernity, conceptions of national modernity, and then conceptions of global modernity, right? I mean, engineering, really at every stage, right? It's seen as the means to, forms of modern self-definition, right? First as national and then as global.
And also, does it have anything to do with the idea of inequity in terms of investment in public health in India, particularly from the beginning? Like that's also, like, for example, what you're saying is right. Nation building and nation state conceived as this modern industrial. In this context, engineering becomes symbol of this modern national modernization. But public health, is not conceived as this very important aspect of nation building.
That's
that
interesting.
doctors do not form as a very important part of imagination of modernity.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah.
I was just quickly, so there are many questions, as you can imagine. So I'm just going to quickly summarize a couple of questions concerning, I suppose, when you brought up the question of modernity, the history of colonialism, which is also something that Chinya mentioned in his comments. And these are questions concerning the shift that you mark between the fact that, artisanal castes were, put out of what you would think of as engineering professions, and these were taken up as part of the modern engineering education system, largely by Brahmins and associated caste privileged groups. And I think the question here is, to what degree do you ascribe that shift also to Victorian understandings of, I think the word that was used was the people who deserved to learn and the people who deserve to be educated versus not. And the reason I think that question is being posed is because it allows us to maybe think about caste not just as, not just old wine in new bottles, but also becoming new and shifting according to different kinds of power structures in which people inhabit.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, so, one shift that I've already pointed to was this sort of delinking of caste and occupation in a way that allowed for, I suppose one could say, kind of a colonial reformulation of caste, right? So that's sort of one instance, right, of transformation. And yes, I mean, I don't for a second want to say that that what we're looking at is simply a process of social reproduction, right? Right? It's not. This is not a story of simple continuity of privilege, right? It's very much about. It's not just. I mean, it's both about this kind of dialectic between subaltern assertion and claims to upper casteness, but it's also about caste itself taking on new meanings, right? The mechanisms of caste distinction shifting over time, right? And the way status is both embodied and expressed also shifting, right? Yes, so the 18th century Brahmin doesn't look very much like the 21st century Brahmin, right? And so there's a kind of dynamism to caste formation, which is captured, which I think is sort of interestingly captured through a focus on technical skill and knowledge, and which allows us to see that you know, on the one hand, sort of upper castes are engaging in a form of maneuver that allows them to continuously have the upper hand, in a sense, right? They're able to sort of maintain a certain standing by, you know, becoming engineers, going global, becoming entrepreneurs, right? So there's this kind of constant maneuver, but you know, I don't want to posit the idea that this maneuver is a form of some kind of sort of innate caste propensity, right? I mean, it's more to point to just the dynamism of caste, right? That this is, that even if there are forms of distinction that are maintained, the symbolics of distinction, the mechanics of distinction, right, shift dramatically over time, right? And that's really important to capture.
Yeah. I think what you've also captured perhaps is the dynamism as well as the dialectic relationship of caste self-presentation with other things. And, you know, I think the Dravidian movement's challenge to caste capital in the 1950s, 60s, the way you show how it is a precedent, in a sense, a template for later iterations is very helpful. I want to, sorry, go ahead. I didn't
really get at the kind of the point about the Victorian era, and I'm not sure I fully understood it. I mean, so one of the things that happens is, and you know, I talked about this in relation to the modern examination, right? That there's this idea of desert, right? Right, that there's and which is in some ways a very modern idea, right? That
I think that's the category that caught people's eye.
Yeah. That there's that you know, one has to kind of claim a status in a different way. That it's no longer birth, right?
It's no longer entitlement.
It's no longer entitlement. It's labor, right? It's desert. It's not entitlement. It's desert, and that shift is really significant. And so you know. And the exam becomes a really key mechanism that allows for privilege to become merit or entitlement to become desert, right? And I think so. The examination as a whole serves this purpose. But part of what I do, I have this whole chapter on the exam, and part of what I do is show that even as the mass examination is instituted, right? There's this constant sort of surveillance of who gets in and who doesn't, right? And this kind of anxiety over it becoming too democratic a mechanism, right? And the need to keep sort of shifting the rules of the game so that the people you want to get through, right? So once again, there's a kind of, there's a sort of technology that claims to be universalistic, right? In both aspiration and outcome, but hides within it, right, certain sort of forms of exclusion, right, and stratification. So, so yes, and you know, part of I think what I tried to do in the talk is talk about this in terms not just of a dialectic between kind of groups, but between ascription and achievement, right? So one has to make claims on the basis of achievement, no longer just on the basis of ascription, right? But ascription is always there, right? So even if achievement is in theory available to all, there are forms of ascription that are always smuggled in, right? And create new barriers, right? Yeah.
I now want to maybe read out a whole set of questions around racialization and caste, right? And again, this was something that Professor Rangam brought up, which is to say that, you know, when we listen to your talk and we, you know, when I heard heard you outline, I'm sure this is the case with a number of people who wrote in, what you point to are moves that are very, very similar to white privilege, right? And a certain kind of whiteness that is being increasingly called out in the North American context in new ways. And at the same time, I think the fact that your book and your research has addressed the mobility of upper caste Indians moving into places like California to the high-tech sector there, and becoming very much part of the fabric of the tech sector there. The way in which you discussed that was to use the term, and I think I wrote this down, racial ascription. And so I was wondering, how does this idea of racial ascription, or the concept of racial ascription, help you think through the ways in which caste and race privilege converge, but are also not exactly, perhaps would you agree that they're not exactly the same, they're not, but they're very much in proximate and intimate with each other?
Yeah.
So there were about 5 or 6 questions about that. So that's the kind of my best summary.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the reasons why this diasporic population is interesting to think with is because in both contexts, right, whether in India or the US, they are, they're kind of navigating a race caste dynamic, right? So even in the Indian context, I mean, the IITs, they sort of style themselves as world-class institutions, which means that they're sort of acutely aware of their global standing, right? And so there's this constant need to say that the IITs are India's window onto the world, right? That what is being produced at the IITs is the Indian answer to global modernity, right? Right? That this is about India's kind of a form of racial arrival, right, on the global stage. The IITs are kind of mediating that form of racial arrival. So there's a form of sort of race consciousness that's very present, right? And that does intersect in really interesting ways with forms of caste consciousness, right? And I think one of the reasons why there is such a kind of a kind of visceral antipathy towards reservations, for instance, is because there's this kind of terror of it diluting this account of racial arrival, right? That what the sort of entry of lower caste does is it dilutes the brand, right? It really sort of interrupts this story, right, of racial arrival. And you see this, this kind of gatekeeping, which is intended to shore up the brand, right? As the sort of global Indian brand, you see this gatekeeping happening on both ends of this, both within India and in the United States. So when I talk about racial ascription, I'm not suggesting that it starts in Silicon Valley, but upper caste in Silicon Valley are obviously differently positioned than they were in India. And there's a very sort of conscious effort to produce a kind of mythology of Indianness, right? And to equate it with technical prowess, which obviously has been incredibly effective, right? And I think one of the things you're seeing in the Cisco case, right, is that the exposure of caste as a form of privilege, right, which has allowed for the kind of enormous numbers of Indians in Silicon Valley, that is really threatening, because it threatens a kind of narrative of self-fashioning, of self-making, right, of a kind of racial genius, right, which in the context of the US is made even more available because it fits with a kind of model minority account, right, of Indian American success. So I think caste, I mean, exposing caste as a kind of, as foundational to Indian American success is a huge threat, right? Because it's been easy in the context of the US to both avow and disavow caste, right? I think in the private sphere and within these sort of communitarian spaces, caste identity is very openly discussed, right? It's embraced with no shame, and it's not a kind of, there's no defensiveness there, right? Because one doesn't have these forms of oppositional caste politics to put you kind of on the defense. But it's not a public identity in the US, right? And so something like the Cisco case threatens to sort of make it a public identity, right? And to kind of rewrite the Indian American success story as one of caste privilege and not simply of kind of racial talent, right?
Your point is well taken, especially, you know, and I think one of the commentators in the chat box pointed this out, which is that Kamala Harris was identified by mainstream press as a South Indian Brahmin with no, you know, it's sort of a very matter of fact roll through, right? Whereas
not just as a Tamil Brahmin, but as somehow that her Tamil Brahminness and her blackness, where that there was no tension between these two things.
That's right. That's right.
You know, they were sort of seamlessly interwoven in her identity, right? Which speaks volumes about the kind of non-recognition of caste in the US, right?
The cunning of, you know, multiculturalism. There's also a question here that asks you to maybe comment on sort of studies of merit, critical studies of merit in the US higher education context. There's a specific comment here about SAT exams and, you know, how studies came out about how, in a way, they showed up various forms of privilege rather than be an open universal exam. And I suppose I would add to that and say, you know, do you speak to that literature and do you feel invested in kind of those kinds of critiques of merit that we see coming out of sociology departments in particular on US higher education?
I haven't engaged that directly with that literature. I would say that I'm more, I think I'm more invested in it as a, less as a scholar and more as a teacher, right? I mean, I'm very concerned with how admissions function in American higher education, right? And you know, I mean, the term diversity is now bandied about to the point where it becomes it's become meaningless, right? So, you know, what does it mean to diversify these spaces? To, you know, and just like the mass examination in other contexts, there was a moment when the SAT was seen as the answer to inherited privilege, right? That this was a kind of anonymous test, right? Where, you know, diction and other kind of embodied forms of cultural capital would not play a role, right? In determining access to education. So, you know, and so that hope, I think, has been pretty clearly belied, right, by the outcomes of these examinations. And you know, you see how in the US, I mean, this is playing out through tensions between Asian Americans, for instance, right, who are arguing that even the kind of anemic approach to sort of compensatory discrimination in the US, that even that is a violation of meritocracy, right? And the only way to institute a truly meritocratic admissions process is to rely entirely on the examination, right? And not to take into consideration any other sort of metrics, right? And any other sort of bases of evaluation. So I'm really interested in that whole conversation and how, in some ways, Asian Americans have become this. I mean, this is not to say that they've had no agency in this, but in some ways they've become a kind of convenient tool as well, right? For dismantling affirmative action once and for all. So yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in the history and present and future of affirmative action in the United States. So it's through that I'm interested in the admissions question, less through the standardized exam itself. But obviously the standardized exam has become kind of.
And I think just thinking through your response, what you make clear is that meritocracy sort of works in its dissimulative manner, right? It sort of dissimulates as well as it has a kind of direct buy-in. So the two things happen at the same time. So a variety of groups can partake of it and then sort of refashion it as you know, as they become, as they enter into spaces that they may have not been, and as they are able to, and as they feel sort of threatened by the incursion of others into those kinds of spaces.
Yeah.
So I guess,
yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I would say it's the sort of it's the ultimate claim to desert, right?
So one final question, and maybe, you know, it's 2 minutes to 6 EST. So maybe I'll ask both of you to speak very perhaps briefly over the next 5 minutes or so. And this has to do with a number of questions that came up concerning anti-caste activism on college campuses, specifically the IITs, and I think the word that was used is what success are they having, what kind of consciousness raising are they doing, and how much is the institution sort of responding to those kinds of organisms?
So why don't I go first, and then Professor Jangam, you can jump in. I think one of the things that, I mean, I think it depends on how you define success, but you know, since 2006, central government campuses have seen a large influx, right, of new groups who come in through reservations and who now form a critical mass that is much harder to marginalize, right? So there are kind of forms of polarization on these campuses that are quite new, right? And the reason that they're there is because this sort of critical mass of students has laid claim to these campuses, right? They're not in the shadows in the way that they once were. They've laid claim to these campuses. You know, they have, and you know, and Modi's rise, I think, has exacerbated this state of polarization, because now it's no longer simply a kind of claim to merit, right? There's been this very sort of open and clear alignment between a kind of upper caste defensive politics and Hindu majoritarianism, right? So the identitarianism of these campus, I mean, there's a kind of identitarian turn in expressions of upper casteness on these campuses that one could, I actually see this as like a move in the right direction, right? Because it means that there's a kind of unmasking that's happened, right? So this sort of claim to a sort of comfortable universalism is no longer possible, right? So you've got upper caste on these campuses having to make an explicit claim in a way that wasn't even necessary before, right? There's a kind of like, there's a turf battle underway, and I do think that there's I think it's actually allowed for lower caste students to feel a sense of belonging, right? And not feel like imposters, which I think was the much more kind of general sentiment before, right? So on the one hand, you're having these forms of, polarization, the central government acting sort of on behalf of one group against the other, right? So the sort of the surveillance, the hostility, I mean, all of that has also escalated, and sometimes it has disastrous and tragic outcomes, like the death of Rohit Vemula, right? Or the institutional murder of Rohit Vemula. So both of these things are happening at the same time, right? There's a much more kind of explicit claim to these spaces, which I think is a good thing, right? There's a kind of increasing defensiveness on the part of upper caste, which I also think is important, right? They've sort of been unmasked in a sense. But, it also means that the most vulnerable groups are subject to the whims, not just of administrators, but of the Hindu right, right? They're kind of exposed in a way that they weren't before.
Chinaya, a few sentences if you want.
Yes, thank you again. And it's a wonderful conversations. I think one of the reasons why I think we are able to have these conversations precisely because of anti-caste activism across campuses by the students, and which actually is one reason why we are gathered today, because because of the sacrifices and also everyday activism. And like one important thing I note in this whole conversation is that how the moral emptiness of upper caste, particularly, they don't have any moral guilt about their privilege, and they're not morally accountable. I think this is where anti-caste activism is one of the important presence, like especially after 2006, is that they're able to push this social justice agenda and claims to nation. And by doing that, what they're doing is that they're challenging the privileged caste and how basically they're inherited privileges. And it is in this context, I think, why the Hindu right state takes the side of this privileged and tries to make all sorts of efforts to cut the voice of the unprivileged sections in society. So I think in that context, I think this battle, particularly the battle between the privileged and the battle, the claims of the unprivileged, identitarian claims, shows this very interesting aspect of this, how the politics of democracy are very critical to the idea of social justice. So in this context, I think if you really want to counter this sham meritocratic argument, one of the ways in which is to have this democratic dialogue and also democratic assertion, which basically challenges the privileged and makes the upper caste accountable for their historical privileges and oppression. Thank you.
I think it's very important to end as well on this ethical note. And I want to apologize to all our participants who are in the space and whose questions we could not answer or bring up. I hope to have covered a lot of the thematics. There were a number of things on gender, for example, which we didn't bring up. But I do hope that this is one of more conversations to come. And
also about Muslims and Christian identity.
We will hopefully continue this in various other forums, but in the meantime, I want to warmly thank Professor Subramaniam. Ajanta, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. Wonderful, Bhavani, for getting us together. And thank you, Ajanta. It was really great.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. And
Jai Bhim to you all.
Yes, and I really want to continue the conversation in some capacity.
Good night, everybody, and hopefully our paths will cross one way or the other. Thank you. Bye-bye.